The long-awaited legal advice of the Solicitor General regarding the voice to Parliament has been revealed. The Commonwealth's top legal advisor provided 100 pages of advice on the voice, which claimed the proposal is not only legally sound, but an enhancement of the system of democracy we've had, just for hundreds of years. The advice is expected to bolster the Yes campaign, but there are still many questions that remain unanswered, and to answer them for us is our great friend and legal affairs contributor, the Australian from the Australian newspaper, Chris Merritt. Chris, always great to see you and listen to your opinions. What did you make of the Solicitor General's advice? What does it mean?
Well, I was a little underwhelmed, quite frankly. The advice primarily was about whether the High Court would be able to say that, look, there's a constitutional implication here, that X and Y come out of the words of the constitutional provision. Now, this was from Stephen Donoghue, the Solicitor General. Now, you might remember a case called Love and Tom's about...
Yes.
This is a case in which Stephen Donoghue tried very hard to persuade the High Court not to find a constitutional implication, and the High Court said, sorry, there is a High Court, a constitutional implication which will limit the ability of the federal government to deport foreign citizens after they serve a criminal sentence. So just bear that in mind when you consider the strength of what Solicitor General Stephen Donoghue says about constitutional implications. Now, that said, this has been portrayed as a clean bill of health for the voice. I don't think it is at all. It's a response to two very specific questions. It wasn't an overall assessment of the provision. It was two questions. One, is this compatible with the Australian system of government? And the other one concerned, will the government be able to legislate to prevent agencies of the executive from considering the views of the voice? Now, just think about that. Why is it important? If this voice is going to be so significant, why does the government want to have the ability to legislate and tell agencies, sorry, you can ignore it. You don't have to take advice from the voice. Wouldn't it be nice to know right now which of those agencies will be able to ignore the voice?
And,
James.
And Chris, I mean, what you say there about the legislation, the ability to legislate, once you legislate, you're immediately talking about something that can wind up in the High Court. And let's remember that Solicitor Generals are just essentially the government's barrister. They'll mount a case for the government, and oftentimes this comes to grief. I'm thinking about in 2011 when the Solicitor General under the Gillard government said, oh, well, the Malaysia solution, we send refugees to Malaysia, said, that's a safe third country. The High Court said, no. Solicitor General's advice often hits the High Court and hits a roadblock. Isn't that correct?
Look, it's the advice of a very senior silk. It's of very great significance, but it's of no more significance than, I would suggest, the submission to the parliamentary inquiry by Ian Callanan, the former High Court judge. And he seems to believe that if anyone makes a representation, there'll be, of course, an understanding that it would be considered. So I think it just needs to be kept in perspective. Yes, it's a valuable contribution to the debate, but it's not conclusive. Once you put something in the Constitution, the only conclusive ruling on that, on what it means and what flows from it, will be from the judges of the High Court, not from the Parliament.
Rita.
And we've had other senior legal figures, former Supreme Court judges also, and even some of them who have been are supporters of the voice, make this same argument that there is going to be scope for the High Court's involvement. So why have we seen this almost ridiculous representation of the Solicitor General's advice as the final verdict, that this settles the matter, there is no argument, there is no doubt, there's no risk, press ahead and put the voice?
Look, I think the criticism has hit home. The criticism that the Solicitor General's advice had not been made public has hit home. But remember, what advice are we talking about? The advice that has been made public was only drawn up 2 days before it was submitted to the parliamentary inquiry. So it's not the original advice. This is advice on questions designed by the government and put to
Two narrow questions.
That's right.
Two very narrow. Are we going to see, before we go and vote, the full advice that was given to the government when they came up with the proposal, when they came up with the wording that we're all going to
Look, I think
vote
that
on?
I think it's going to be almost inevitable. I think if the government refuses to make that all the advice, all the Solicitor General's advice available, I think it will set the yes case back. But look, I think it's heading off in the wrong direction though. What this advice is all about is the question of litigation. Litigation can or cannot take place. Put that to one side. What we're talking about is changing our system of public policy debate to establish The Voice as a publicly funded lobby group for one racial group will change how this country operates. It would be like constitutionalising the ACTU or the Business Council, giving them public
Or
funds.
ATSIC, for that matter. I mean, we kind of have been down this
Yeah, we've
road
done
with
it,
a big governing body that gives advice, and this time it would be ATSIC with constitutional protection.
All of that goes to what I consider to be the fundamental issue here, and it's not litigation, it's equality of citizenship. Now, if we all are equal, we should all have the same ability to affect public policy debates. And whatever happens with The Voice, if the High Court decides it can litigate to force people to consider its views, I don't think that really matters. Once The Voice says something, and the Solicitor General actually confirmed that the scope of The Voice's involvement in public policy debate can't be limited by the government. It can limit what the agencies of the government do with that advice, but it can't change, or it can't restrict the role of The Voice. So just imagine, once The Voice says something on anything, regardless of whether the public service is obliged to consider it, it will play out in public policy debates in the media. Of course, it will influence the way we go.
Sorry, James, just quickly, you mentioned equality. We had an article in The Guardian this week by the Race Discrimination Commissioner, Chin Leong Tan, who said, quote, in this article in The Guardian, equality does not mean we are all treated the same.
Oh,
Where does...
is that from Animal Farm or is that
Well,
from
it's
the
straight out of
Spectator?
George
Okay.
Orwell's Animal Farm. Equality does not mean we are all treated the same. Where's this voice really going to take us? What's the bottom line? What's the story? What's self-determination about? What's treaty about? What is all the bottom line here, legally?
With the greatest respect to the Commissioner, I'd put a little bit more weight on the views of David Jackson, a leading silk, former judge of the Federal Court, and he made a submission to the parliamentary inquiry, and there's no doubt about it, he said we would cease to be equal. Simple as that.
We would
by
cease to be
design.
equal. You vote for The Voice, people. You cease to be equal in this nation. That's what you're aiming at, James.
Finally, Chris, I want to ask, one of the big things that we are told about is that if the no case gets up, it's a huge setback to reconciliation. But what would it do for the idea of a harmonious society that you would have one group of people that is about 3%, I think, of the population having this agency that would have very little risk attached to anything that it recommended, but then having the huge weight of its moral authority and potentially legally enshrined authority as well on the development of policy? What would that send to the other 97% of people, whether they've been here 200 years or 20 years like me?
Look, you can see it already, and resentment is what will grow, and that's the antithesis of what we should be aiming at. If we're serious about reconciliation, we shouldn't be exacerbating the differences on the basis of race that are already in the Constitution. It's inevitable that once you start treating one group on the basis of race and their descendants forever, treat them differently, give them a different, more powerful ability to influence public policy, the vast majority, or those who are left out, will not like it. They will see over time that it's not fair, and fairness is what this country is all about.
Particularly when decisions influenced or on the whim of the voice start to have a negative impact on people's lives. Could be an increase in tax, could be a this, could be a that, whatever. And yes, Chris Merritt, Merritt by name, Merritt by nature. Always great to have you here on Outsiders for your legal opinion. Thanks so much.